Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being on time. Today is going to be a super exciting session. My name is Paul Sims from Impatient Health. I'm speaking to you from HQ in London, and I'm going to introduce some fantastic people in just 1 second. But first, a couple of words. This session, the metrics or the truth? Well, a slightly controversial title and one that has attracted more than 500 of you, which is not the biggest webinar that we do, but the fact that it is late July and so many of you are indeed signed up, and here I can see that we've got a good audience listening in right now, is not too shabby, is it? Right? We are doing pretty strong for this topic. It is definitely something interesting. As you can see, the subtitle, What Your Dashboard Won't Tell You and Why Smart Executives Still Fail. Okay, so you can clearly see that we're not necessarily saying the metrics are wrong. We are saying that there might be more to it than just the metrics. And pharma launches are often judged by a mosaic of KPIs, beautifully arranged, meticulously tracked, and sometimes misleading. So we're not here to question the metrics. We're here to question whether or not they're the only things we need. Your dashboard may well show what's helpful, what's measurable, what the critical insights are, but I think they're also ephemeral. Shifts in sentiment, subtle prescribing hesitations, conversations that are fleeting before they're captured, they're not necessarily getting picked up. The nuance is not there. And if we treat all of our launches, all of our marketing just the same, then I think it's going to fail us going forward. I think launch is becoming more challenging, and unless we're keeping up with those challenges, we're going to be behind. So it's like you're working with pumpernickel in a world that needs much more than just basic white bread. We need to get richer, we need actual differentiation, and we need to overlook just the default metrics every time. Okay, so let's see who's joining me for this webinar. There's me, of course, as the host, but I've got four wonderful panelists. Let me just go through them one by one. Liv, been a wonderful friend to get to know over the past couple of years. In particular, her podcast, This Girl Cam, is, in my opinion, a mic drop moment for our industry. And if you haven't heard that, Google it, check it out on the usual platforms right now. But in addition to that podcast, she's obviously a trailblazer at Chiesi and doing some great stuff there too. Damien, many of you were introduced to Damien at our recent Pharmageddon event in Philadelphia, or maybe one or two other events and podcasts he's been invited to recently. A tour de force and definitely a wonderful thinker, someone who, in my opinion, brings a breath of fresh air, not just, of course, to his field of data science, but I also think to other very important areas like access and diversity, and indeed where we need to be pointing as an entire industry. So Damien, an absolute pleasure. Lance, someone who you may have met on one of my previous webinars, someone who I regard as a genuine trailblazer in our industry. He, of course, is a technologist by his own admission, but also a humanist. And I would argue that the work being done at Within3 is driving what we might call a new launch intelligence within our industry. And of course, that is something we cannot ignore going forward. Chris, you may have seen, he joined me for a webinar last year and again on a webinar a year before that. He's been an absolute pleasure to get to know, one of the kindest and most heartfelt people, I believe, in our industry, doing some fantastic work now at J&J, and someone who I believe is genuinely moving that needle bio from sick care to healthcare. So thank you, Chris, an absolute pleasure to have you back. Now, some of you have already started. I can see there's a fair few comments in the chat. That's right, you need to introduce yourself if you haven't done already. Tell us where you're calling from. Tell us why this is more important than going on a summer vacation to you, this webinar, and what indeed you want to hear. So please, if you haven't already done so, I want to hear from you. Now, you might remember that when you signed up for the webinar, you actually answered a couple of questions. So here I am to give you the answers. The first one, when you gather insights, is it more for validation of an existing launch strategy, or will it genuinely enable a real pivot? In other words, actually acting on the data. So, what did we say? Yes, yes. 50% of people, we gather the insights expecting them to challenge our current strategy. That is higher than I expected, and I'm very pleased to see it. We use insights mostly to refine tactics. Over a quarter of you said that. We say we're open to change, but rarely act on what we learn. And then finally, no, truthfully, and we only act when signals are overwhelming. So you can basically say we've got a 50-50 situation here. Half the people feel that we're acting on it and half do not. Interesting. Second question was this one. Which best describes your organization's current insight capability? Well, here we can see it's a bit more even, 38%. What was the 38%? Mixed, okay? I think this one is probably going to represent more of a normal curve. Mixed, adequate data, but fragmented and slow to act, okay? What was next? Good, insights available, but limited predictive power. Basic was the other one, 16%. Reactive, KPI focused reporting only. And then finally, of course, the positive answer, advanced. So a bit of a normal distribution with a slight leaning towards the negative, I would say, on that one. So that's where we are today. That's the situation we are in. And since you did so well on that question, I'm going to actually kick things off in this webinar with a brand new live question. So this should appear on your screen in just 1 second. It sometimes takes a second before it does. And when it does, there we go. So your approach. This is a two-parter. So first part is, which best reflects your organization's approach to harnessing insights during launch? And there's 5 different answers you can give there. And then what's most dangerous to launch success? And I know that you will want to choose several things for each of these polls, and I am truly evil for only allowing you to choose one, but hey, that's just me. Now, I'm going to ask our panel to turn on their cameras, and I'm going to get rid of my slides. And while they're doing that, I'm just going to remind everybody that they are going to be sharing from their own personal perspective, not necessarily representing that of their companies. So please be aware of that. Secondly, we are indeed recording this. You don't need to ask me. We will send the recording to you afterwards. And then finally, now you know that where the chat window is, I really want you guys to use it. Let's make sure today is not a one-way conversation, but it's a multi-way cornucopia of exciting chat. So please make sure that little blue drop-down box is set to everyone, not just hosts and panelists. I can see a few people writing to just me, but let's write to everybody. Okay, guys, thank you so much for joining me and for kickstarting this. I'm going to actually end the poll and we can see the results. I do want to just hear from each of you really about the kind of illusion of the insights that we're getting right now and whether or not you feel that we're reliant on KPIs, metrics, and even insights that aren't good enough, that are outdated or maybe just not available quick enough, or maybe just not believed. I would love to just hear your reflections as all of you are tasked with either surfacing or using said insights. What's your general impression of that? Who wants to go first?
I can go first if you'd like.
Go for it, Liv.
Why not? So I can obviously come at this from a local level. Certainly when we are trying to, I think, in fact, there was a question in the chat that I just saw about someone said, how are we actually defining an insight, which I think is a really basic question, but absolutely critical. And it's definitely something that needs clarifying. It depends on the function that you're working with as to what you define as an insight. And that's certainly something that I think is true. Looking at your questions, I would say insights are there, they're plentiful. We can get them from any area of the business. How we act on them is a different question, whether or not they are gathered in real time or collected retrospectively will impact the way they are acted on as well, because they only matter, in my opinion, they only matter when they're gathered in the moment and acted on as quickly.
Trust them today, Liv?
depends where they're coming from.
Okay, fair enough. So you trust
Yeah,
science.
on the whole, of course you have to, don't you? You have to, otherwise what's the point in having them? But again, as I say, if everybody is clear on what we're calling an insight, what the value is of an insight, and therefore if that's clear, then there should be no question around how quickly they need to be acted on and the urgency and impact.
Okay, thank you, Liv. I appreciate it. Chris, Damien, love to hear from you on this.
Maybe if I add, at the other end of the spectrum, if Liv is talking about kind of at the operational level, at country level, where I sit in the global world, we rely on things being tiered up, right? This becomes important for us to understand what are we looking at a global level. So what's going on in the US versus Europe versus Asia, and where are the timings? How are they staggered? Are there learnings that are coming through? I think the thing that comes to mind for me around insights is sometimes we make the mistake that we're knowingly asking the questions we know we're going to get the answers to, rather than asking the questions that we need the answers to, right? So if we're tracking uptake, if we're tracking adoption, how are we doing that? And I think sometimes we need to challenge ourselves into something that is faster, maybe slightly more aggressive, and will give us information that we're not necessarily going to like because it's not going to align to our chosen KPI. Right? If you think about recall or how are we measuring kind of patient uptake, etc. These are often linked to performance metrics, which are success factors for the business as well. So I think we're trying to balance them sometimes a little bit too conservatively, when actually, if we think we've got a therapy that will change the standard of care or drive better outcomes, we also maybe need to be more hard on ourselves and more aggressive on our monitoring, and therefore how we capture those insights needs to be faster. And that's at all levels, right, up to global.
And Chris, what would you say is the root cause of that? What's the incentive behind asking the questions that we only want to hear the right answers to? Is it because we've invested so much and we want it to be a success and nobody wants to be the bad guy? Are we incentivized in the right way? You could even argue, because we want to hit our commercial targets. And, where does it really, let's just take a step back. Where is the root cause and is it fixable?
I think it's a great question. I think all of the above, right? There's conservatism in way back when I was in the UK, we used to call it sandbagging. It probably has more complex names now, but thinking about if you take the Mercedes promise, right, of telling people what they're going to get and being able to do more, that's seen as success, rather than setting a bar that's super high, say shooting for the stars, but only getting to the moon. You're still going to be doing exceptionally well, but it's partly to do with, I think, our mindset of we only believe in success. We don't believe in learning from what might be deemed a failure, right? So it can only be positive is what we're trying to push forward. So I think there's a way of working that we're all guilty of, me included, that I don't want to set KPIs for myself and my team, particularly around launch, that are not going to look successful at the end of the day. So I do think we have to challenge the status quo, but there's some behavioral change in there. So we probably can't answer it fully now, but I think it does come down to looking at how we capture those insights and then use them, maybe alongside some of the traditional, so that we can start implementing change step by step, rather than trying to rip the plaster off and telling everyone they've done a terrible job. Let's just make some advancements and pull them through. So I know it doesn't answer your question fully.
No, you've done better than most politicians, Chris. You've done better than most politicians. You didn't skirt it completely. But just before we move on from you, do you think that this is actually recognized as a problem, or is it just because you happen to be speaking on a webinar right now that it's become front of mind?
I think there is recognition of it, but I don't know if we really truly have action to solve it.
Sure.
So I think it sits somewhere in the grey zone of, we know it's an issue, but we're also okay with what it's giving us at the moment. So what would drive the change?
Lovely basking in the feeling of the right answers. Okay. Well, you can see I've closed the poll, so feel free to look at some of the answers there. Oh, someone's trying to call me. That's broken through my do not disturb on my phone there. Impressive. Yeah, we've got a few things here. Your approach, which I'll let you go through these at your leisure, because I want to hear from Damien. Damien, what is your critical insight here?
I mean, I think I agree with a lot of what Liv and Chris are saying, but I think I want to touch more upon the last point, is the sense that it's not so much finding the insights, and there are definitely challenges there, but it's how do we respond to them? I use the analogy often, it's not like turning a speedboat, it's like turning a cruise ship, in the sense that it's something that you really have to plan for way ahead of time, and there really isn't a lot of active intelligence that allows for that, and there's no internal mechanisms for doing that. And even when you're successful, sometimes success can work against you. Look at Wegovy. The shortages there were predictable, but ultimately they had no way of actually responding to the increased demand. It's the sense that when problems arise, even when you can foresee them, literally, there just isn't the infrastructure to do it. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that much of pharma's sort of research and development infrastructure has just been moved to an on-demand model. What isn't offshored or, contracted out is frankly kept to such a bare minimum that when there is a problem, when something does need to change, even on the manufacturing distribution side, there's bare minimum resources, which means you either have to develop completely new things, which takes months or a year or more, or you have to, effectively reposition a lot of things quickly, which cannot happen. And so I think the bigger problem is we need to change how we approach this in terms of, regardless of how we're getting information or where we're getting it in from, we have to be able to respond to it better. Otherwise, it's worthless. I mean, ultimately, information is only useful if you can act on it. And I think that's the bigger challenge here because fundamentally, I think we're not really set up in a way where we can respond quickly to anything, regardless of the nature of the problem.
So, Damien, you're in charge of data science at Takeda. Is that a problem that you can solve? Do you believe it's in your wheelhouse to do? And are you making progress?
I mean, progress, no. Is it solvable? Yes. Ultimately, by restructuring teams, by expanding internal investment, by doing things that farmers avoided for decades. It could be done if uh, uh, there's a resistance to keeping anything that doesn't show ROI. Anything left idle for any length of time is just seen as wasteful and ultimately is let go at every reorg. You have to keep parts of your organization like that. There has to be things sitting idle because you need those things to be ready when you need to respond quickly. As we get to the mindset where everything has to be kept lean and where we have to be, sort of actively functional in every part of our organization, you can never respond to anything because the people you're asking to make changes quickly are already overwhelmed. And so you're really not going to get much out of them, in a very rapid fashion.
Lance, I want to hear your opinion on this because, I mean, I was about to say you have the luxury of being able to see across all clients, but I imagine you also have the frustration of knowing that there is so much that we can do about this, and not everyone is firing on all cylinders, as we already saw in the poll results. So maybe give us a sense of your pain. We can treat this as a shrink session for you if you like, but also just where is this challenge coming from?
Yeah, I think maybe hitting what Damien was just talking about from a different angle. I think one of the challenges is because the reality for most companies organizationally is what Damien just described in terms of team setup and things like that. But on the other hand, the time it takes, the challenge, the difficulty, the cost to be in a model where you can actually understand what's going on in the marketplace very, very quickly, to have data-driven conversations about that aren't just kind of feeding an existing metric structure. That's really challenging for a lot of teams using kind of the way technology and data has worked historically. And so it reinforces these sort of um, heads down, check the box, try to get it done sort of headsets. And I think that can be addressed with where solutions are now versus where things were a few years ago. I also wanted to hit on a couple of things that I think I saw come up in the chat. Um, Fundamentally, what's an insight, I think is a great question. I understand there's probably about half medical affairs people and half commercial people ish on the webinar today. I think even what that answer is by those two groups varies. I tend to think about it as kind of a continuum of maybe customer insights all the way to market insights. So things you're looking at whole, maybe within a region, versus I'm going to see Dr. Paul Sims. What insights do I have on him? And I view insights as things that either help you validate that what you're doing is the right thing, or alert you that you should be doing something else. Otherwise, it's just information, and it's not that useful, frankly. It's just interesting. And so that requires analysis to understand what we're seeing, how does that compare with what we think is real or not real? And then to act on that requires the courage, I think, that both Chris and Damien were talking about. And I think a lot of the problem that we have is when you're at a senior level, being able to know what's real, what's not, what's noise, what's not, and in a timely fashion where I can actually make a difference, get there faster is historically very difficult to do.
Yeah, most definitely. Panel, if you want to jump in on anything, please do say. And in the meantime, I'm also going to launch another poll called Insight Gaps. So we'll see indeed where the audience sees the challenge to be, and hopefully get some wisdom of the crowd on that. The other thing I'm also seeing a lot in the chat is the desire for any cases or practical examples of where this has manifested itself. So panel, obviously, if you are able to share anything, and I know that Lance has got a couple of things to share shortly as well. But yeah, any reaction to what we've heard?
Just
Don't all shout at once.
agreement.
Just an agreement, Chris.
Yeah, it's listening in whilst you're taking part in a webinar. You're also learning at the same time, and I think it's nice to hear the other perspectives, that we're not kind of sitting on our own. I agree with some of the comments in the chat around kind of some examples, and I think we're all probably cautious not to give too many things of our own disease areas and things that are away, and trying to kind of round them up a little bit to make them more general. But yeah, I think what I'm hearing is a desire to push some change and actually have more meaningful insights that we can adapt to quickly. There seems to be a strong message coming through as well. I think Damien hits on it too, of the ability to flex within the team. And if the insights tell you something that's not per your plan, how much backup do you have to adapt? And what does it mean? You can't necessarily delay launch because this is a big driver of value for the business and return. But at the same time, if the insights are going to tell you something else, what can you do to adapt? And can you kind of pre-think that is there a point in time when you're going to get insights that will tell you how you're doing, that particularly if you're in that launch phase, is there something that you can build into your planning that will help you to adapt if you get something that you're not expecting? Because I think there is a bit of a pull through on this that says we're doing the insights work in a way to keep confirming we're doing the right thing. But realistically, that's the wrong question, because it shouldn't be, are we confirming we're doing the right thing? It should be telling us this works, this is happening, this is the response that we get. And then you either double down or continue, right, in those areas, or you need to adapt and change course. I think there's a couple of sailing analogies in there, with the various storms and stuff that are around. If you try and go from Southampton to New York, take a Titanic route, it is not a straight line, right? You have to navigate around those various obstacles on the way. I think we need to think about insights as navigation points as well that will help us to adapt and ultimately should be improving the efficiency of our journey rather than deterring us into a longer, less effective course.
Mm. Yeah. Anyone else from the panel want to share? Or Lance, obviously happy for you to share some cases as well. Go for it.
I can jump in maybe with some specific examples. So as you mentioned, Paul, we work with a lot of companies, small biotechs with one asset traversing through the life cycle all the way to very large organizations, and acquisition assets as well, where large organizations are entering a new therapeutic area for them based on acquiring an asset. And while there are obviously very specific things per asset and so forth, you tend to see a lot of things that are examples of this problem. So I can think of an example where, first of all, just to paint a broad brush, I tend to think about launch as kind of like the commercialization. So maybe like launch like 3 years out to a couple years after. So that broad continuum versus the actual act of approval and launch. And what you're doing throughout that is you're trying to understand the market well, so you can create a launch plan, so you can begin to execute a launch plan, so you can do the things that Chris was just talking about. We've seen clients where they go into that early work with a segmentation plan of who are the HCPs, for example, in a particular region that they think are along the patient journey or the treatment journey. and then recognize through insights and data that there are ancillary folks, ancillary referrers, ancillary specialists, where they're not geared towards at all, that are part of that treatment journey, that are actually impacting the outcome of patient adoption. And by the time that's realized, it's usually far too late. We've seen examples where the segmentation that's done in terms of which cohorts of folks are actually going to be most impactful to thinking about changing clinical behavior aren't set up correctly or in reality. We see a lot of examples. So a marketplace is really complicated. We see a lot of examples in competitive markets where we're out executing something on, on our course, and our competitors are doing something different. The messaging is changing, the perceptions are changing. You see this especially a lot around medical congresses, which are kind of like microcosms of this, where without that ability to really step back and re-challenge the market information that you're seeing, you continue down a path, and then you recognize, weeks and weeks, if not months and months later, that you're on the wrong path. You're not achieving the targets that you were looking for. We see a lot of examples. I think the dynamic between Liv and Chris, where maybe some sort of analysis was done top down, but varies at the regional level. And so the ability to take this same conversation and regionalize it very deeply versus I can only kind of sort of do that at a very high level, and then I'm really just relying on field work on a regional basis. We see a lot. And all of this has in common is an inability to access a view of the marketplace extraordinarily quickly in a flexible way that is tied back to strategy.
Thank you, Lance. Thank you. I'm going to close the poll in 3 seconds. So if you haven't answered, you've got 3 seconds to do it. Really interesting answers there. Thank you, Lance, for adding that color. 3, 2, 1, and let's have a look at the results on that. Taking a second. Apologies. There we go. So you can see that 2/5 roughly of people say HCP pushback or hesitancy is the signal that has caught people off guard most as the highest thing, but actually it's a pretty even spread. Competitors, patients, local markets, internal misalignment, all of them 30% or thereabouts. Second question, what source of insights do you trust least but wish you could trust more? I expected AI to win this one, but actually social listening and quantitative feedback getting interesting. The quantitative survey feedback getting an equal first place, and in very close fourth place, I guess, is the anecdotal feedback from field teams. So clearly there is quite a lot of distrust across the channels, both in terms of the questions being answered and the channel that they arrive in. So I think that is critical. Any comment from panel on that before we move on to the next topic?
It's actually interesting how distributed that answer is. When I see answers like that are, you ask like, hey, what's the problem, and it's very distributed. To me, that just speaks to something is really hard, because if it was that easy, that you'd concentrate the problem in one area versus another.
Indeed.
I think the only thing for me on that is wherever you're getting your insights from my perspective, an insight can only ever inform a conversation. So, and again, it's that focus on action. What are you going to do about it? It's all very well having the insight, but if you haven't got the resource and you haven't had the correct communication in place to support the implementation of the correction that is needed on the gathering of that insight, then it's a waste of energy. It's a complete waste of time. So for me, yes, the insights can come from various parts of different functions. The communication loop has to be there, and it can never replace the conversation that needs to take place around it.
Indeed.
Is there a question here as well with regards to if 4 out of 5 of the areas are questionable, right? We're looking across whether it's anecdotal feedback, quantitative, qualitative. We're essentially a relatively even split across the board, as Lance says. Is the problem more fundamental, that we have to understand that if we as business professionals within the pharma industry are struggling with trust with regards to the insight, is the true question, do we understand how we're asking the questions? Because if we're not quite getting the answer, are we listening to the question in the first place? And are we really bought into the process we're going into? So we all have preferences for how we prefer research to be done or various things, but we also have specific research professionals within our organizations that will help and work with the various agencies to partner and design the questionnaires. But if we as leaders don't take active engagement in what are we asking and why, and what are we trying to understand here, do we really trust the outcome if we haven't engaged fully in the process? So I think there's a bit of yin and yang that's going to go into this. I can definitely give examples where I've not paid enough attention because of other competing things. But I can also give examples where I've absolutely paid attention because I know how critical it is to the business. And then I feel very confident when I see the results, and often very relieved because I'm seeing things that I needed to start to come true in order to be able to develop the strategy further. So I think it does also come down to this, how engaged are you in the insight generation? And actually there's a call to action for all of us to understand more that core skill in order to be able to ask the right questions. If we want to be strategists and define a strategy, we also know how to ask the right questions that give us the information to build that strategy.
Yes, indeed. What I want to do, guys, is building on what Chris has just said. We need to start moving. We've already run over the halfway point of this webinar. We need to move on to solutions. We've been talking about challenges, and clearly we could talk about challenges for several hours. And I want to talk about solutions and whether or not it's what Chris says, it's asking the better question, or whether or not technology can be part of the answer, or whether or not it's something more strategic and more about our organizational or people design that needs to be put forward. Lance, as the resident technologist, do you have something to share on that?
Yeah, I can give you our perspective in the part of this that we're trying to solve. So I definitely think there's, again, kind of a Venn diagram between organizational structure, between kind of communication and motivation to address results, and then your ability to access and trust the information you need to make better decisions. And those things influence each other. And when one is not set up very well, it definitely it impacts all three. And I think the best launch teams are able to kind of cut through that. But I'll give you our sense on the perspective, and I'll share just a couple of slides. We've been talking on the problems, as you said, Paul, for quite some time on this call. I went and pulled stats from various sources that all say the same thing, that launches are really, really hard. I think I pulled stats 20 years ago and saw similar stats. And so I don't think the industry's made a bunch of improvement, just generally speaking, on trying to solve this problem. You can see all the different, third parties all pretty much saying the same thing. One of the things that I think is that we find interesting is in pharmaceutical world, unlike other industries, the firewall between medical and commercial really impacts how launch planning and thinking is done. So, I'm in the technology industry. If you think of the part of medical affairs that is around, the scientific narrative, understanding the fit of a potential therapy in the marketplace, understanding a competitive landscape, understanding unmet need, those sorts of things would be part of the commercialization function, usually under one umbrella in most other industries. You can't do that in pharma for obvious reasons. And so I think one of the things that we see is in many organizations, commercial and medical teams are working with different data sets, different strategies or ways of interpreting it. There's certainly oftentimes different backgrounded sets of people. And that causes issue and rework. I think at a high level, you can boil it down to you have a list of questions that we're trying to answer along the continuum of a commercialization. And the challenge is underneath all of that is different data sets with different time frames and how long it takes to get them and different costs, and different parts of the organization have access to some things, not other things. And this picture becomes incredibly complicated. And I feel that that's the reason why you have even distributions on the poll question that we just had. while you can really spend a whole hour diving into one of these issues, it's just incredibly complicated. If you need to go do primary research, as an example, every time you have a certain set of questions, that takes a very long time and it's outdated oftentimes by the time it's done. And in the real world, a market view, these things are interrelated. So maybe I did primary research questions to ask some things about HCP sentiment, but I'm also getting HCP sentiment in the market surfaced other ways. And if that's not connected all together, I'm getting an incomplete view. I don't trust the data. I don't move forward. And so I think the new way is a bit different. And this is where I know folks like Damien, I'm sure you're doing these sorts of things within Takeda as well. But instead of moving from the old commission a primary research, go buy a claims data set in the US, go purchase a data for a particular point in time, the new way is to model the market. So to take all those data sets that are interconnected, focus them on whether it's just within Liv's region or whether it's global or both, from Chris's point of view, to model that together. That creates a very large integrated data set where the relationships between what an HCP or a customer is doing across the board is all factored in. And then you can layer AI and analytics on top of that, as well as really flexible reporting. And what that lets you do is then ask questions. I think everyone at this point is familiar with generative AI and chat GPT types approaches. Think of something like that, but trained 100% on your therapy, your region, your model, with a very, very broad data set that you can ask questions to and actually generate narratives and reports that are easier to communicate. That's the new way. That wasn't possible 4 or 5 years ago. It certainly is now. And there's a lot of work being done. And what that does is really change the game. As a launch executive, you can ask a question of the data, get citation, understand relationships, get things back incredibly quickly, get things back in a format you can share and not have to spend hours and hours and hours with whether it's internal analysts or external consultants or those sorts of things, kind of building these really complex, thick decks to communicate these things. The cost of all of that is going way, way down with the more modern launch intelligence sort of approach. What used to take 8 weeks, if not months, can be done in an afternoon with these tools. And I think that's really exciting. We're seeing fundamental shifts in how companies are thinking about launches, but then starting to organize around launches with a different headset that signals are available much closer to real time from local to global versus the old way, which is the assumption is it's weeks, if not months, before you can detect signals. And then the last thing I'll share on that is from a KPI standpoint, I think that what KPIs are great at is tracking things obviously longitudinally, but KPIs assume that you already know the question you need to answer to start with. And that's the thing you need to track longitudinally. And I think that reinforces a little bit of what Chris was talking about of if there's something different in the market from what is in the premise of the KPIs, it can be very difficult to understand and gather. If you have a system on the right where you can literally just ask the market models and you're constantly updating those with as much real-time data as you can, it's much, much more nimble. So the examples that I shared earlier of how companies were able to pivot to different segments, different audiences, react to different competitive information, those are all examples of clients doing things with the model on the right versus the older kind of model approach on the left.
Lance, that is super, super interesting. And I've got like 2 or 3 questions. I'll just do one because time is a-marching. And it's, I think, to do with what I saw you say just towards the end there. We don't know what we don't know. And even when you have an AI real-time surfacing of insights, presumably if you're just used to a ChatGPT style interface, you still need to know what questions to ask. How does the AI proactively tell you things that you might not have thought that you needed to know? Because it's those happy coincidences that, stop us going wrong.
So what we find is everybody approaches it with kind of like 2 ways. One is there is a set of things that they do want to know. They have a strategy, they have strategic imperatives. They have they basically have a layout of what they believe they're trying to accomplish and what they need to understand and measure to be successful. So you absolutely want these tools answering those questions as easily and quickly as possible. But then you basically need an interface where you can surface up. So it's not very difficult to create these tools in such a way that you can have a preset set of things that you're watching for. So we have models based on kind of different aspects of launch as an example. And so when anomalies or exceptions kind of pop out of that are altered from the strategy, we can proactively surface that out and communicate that out. And that's much better than just hoping someone is awake at the switch to kind of ask those sorts of questions versus having a tool surface those things for you. And I think confirmation bias was in some of the chat work earlier. This sort of approach also heavily improves that because a lot of times the preset things you're wondering are the things that you're trying to confirm against your own strategy. This sort of we call them general insights, but this more general insight sort of approach literally starts on the opposite side of that and says, look at the data objectively. What is it telling us before you map it to strategy? So the tools do both, and you can do that because with AI you can analyze massively large sets of integrated data that you couldn't before.
Indeed, indeed. Well, panel, I want to hear your opinions on this, and I'm also asking the audience another poll question, which is just going live now, called Readiness for Change, and it might give us your wisdom as to what you see going forward in a positive way from here. So, guys, does what Lance say sound realistic, useful, feasible in your organization, and of course, valuable? Damien, haven't heard from you for a while. I'm going to pick on you for a second.
Sure.
Okay.
So, no, I mean, I think his approach is reasonable, but it's something that we would have to build internally. See, here's the problem. Most people will think, oh, let's just hire an outside group to do this, and they'll do it. And many times they may do a good job. And then when we don't want to pay them anymore, all of that disappears. What we need to do is build the infrastructure, hire the people, and then don't fire them. Too often what happens is that we spin something up that follows this path, and then either we get bored with it, or it doesn't show immediate ROI, or they're sitting idle too long, and then the next reorg comes around, let's just gut them. I've seen whole offices of data scientists, of AI strategists, of various different folks who could build solutions like this and were doing it. The entire office was closed, no warning, no notice, because it just made fiscal sense to somebody higher up. You cannot do something like this without a long-term commitment. You have to think years. You have to think in 5 years, maybe I'll see ROI. Not next year, not in 6 months, not in a month, which is what a lot of stakeholders and shareholders expect. That mentality is what's really making a solution like this a challenge. But yes, I absolutely think the data is there. It's been there for years. The technology is definitely there, and it's only improving. I think that once we get those pieces together, this could definitely work. But again, we need that longer term commitment from leadership.
Damien, I hear what you're saying, but there are also some very valid, in my opinion, arguments for why we shouldn't be attempting to build some of these things in-house. I'm the son of an IT manager from an oil company who built his own email system internally because that at the time was deemed to be the smart thing to do to protect, to ensure that data didn't leave the walls. And it sounds ludicrous now to think of such a thing. You wouldn't rely on an internal development to build your email systems. So of course, Lance will say it's possible to retain your data hygiene and in-house despite using outside partners. Do you really think that we can and should be doing what many would argue pharma is not there to do, which is to build our own AI technology?
I mean, I'm not discouraging or discounting the value of outside partners, especially since you cannot spin all of this up in overnight. The R&D, just to build the basics of it, would take far too long. But what I'm saying is that every solution is thought of as completely an outside solution. And here's the problem. An outside partner like that is going to be expensive on the outset, and then they're going to just charge you more year over year. That is far more expensive than maintaining something internally. So of the two solutions, the only one that you feasibly could maintain long-term is the internal one, because the external one I can guarantee is going to cost at least 30 to 50% more over time, and it's going to be a constant cost. And I've had this conversation with some very large and big names in the industry who say, you don't want to pay us, fine, we turn everything off. And that really is, basically them holding you hostage over whatever they develop completely. But if it's a partnership where you understand how it works and you have people who can maintain it, build it, enhance upon it, then absolutely, I think this idea. But no, I think it's more of an initial partnership that then is internalized rather than us just trying to reinvent the wheel, to your point, because you cannot build all of this technology from scratch.
Sure, sure, sure. Well, I don't want to dwell on this point because, again, it'd be really easy to spend the remaining minutes of the webinar just on that. But I do want to find out from Liv, from Chris, if they think that some of the tabled solutions could work for them personally within the organization, and whether or not this wider concept of launch intelligence is something that they would welcome and grab with both hands, or if it's something that seems like rearranging the deck chairs.
I can go first on that. So I think for me, yeah, we all know technology is at a point now where these sort of things are capable. There's no denying the advancements we've seen in the last few years have all put us in a place where these solutions are absolutely, they're all options on the table. That's no problem. The issue is more I think, as was Damien referring to, really, is the communication at the end of the day. How do you ensure, yes, someone can maintain that, and then how do you communicate that throughout the business to make it valuable? Because there is going to be no end of technology options available to us to help with certainly obviously with insight collection, but many other parts of our functions where we can make efficiencies. The point is always going to be the communication that surrounds that. I think we as human beings need to keep up with the advancement of technology, and maybe up our game in the way that we communicate with each other, and ensure that if we've built something or bought something, it is continuously valuable because everybody understands and is bought into the value that it can offer them.
I'm going to end the poll, so do answer that. But Liv, you have the word insight in your job title, and I believe you don't describe yourself as a technologist. So what is the, if you had to place your bets on one thing that was going to aid that communication process, something that you can do at a local level to genuinely push this forward, what would it be?
Oh God, I have. There are a lot of things to push the communication forward. People need to take ownership of it. The problem is we have a situation frequently, and nobody is alone in this, where that accountability, this is all relatively new in terms of, these capabilities have come about very quickly in the grand scheme of things. So I think everybody is still catching up, and everyone's talking about AI capabilities and where best to implement them. It is allocating key people who know the system, who know the area. So, as you say, I have insights in my title. I have a market research team that feed into me. Of course, this has a place. Of course it does, but it would be up to that team to say where that place is. So it's all about who's responsible for it, who's accountable for it, and then being able to communicate it.
Well, Chris, I'm going to want your input, but just before I do, you can see the results. A third of people say detecting when launch messaging isn't landing as intended is the thing that they would value the most. In a close second place, spotting those HCP misunderstandings. So it is about that direct HCP influence, if I can call it that. So interesting there. What's your biggest blocker to turning early signals into decisive action? The second question. Again, a third of people saying organizational caution or hesitation. We wait too long to pivot. Again, I think that speaks a little bit to what Liv was saying. It's not the insight, it's what we do with it. Chris. You're on mute, by the way. You're muted, Chris.
Apologies. I think it's kind of difficult to add, but listening to both sides of it, I think there's a bit of both that work for everybody. I think if I was to look for a keyword, keywords, it would be partnership and agility. I think that's what externalizing gives us. But also kind of coming back to what Damien was saying, long-term investment is really what's needed to give us the ability to do that. And I actually think it is long-term investment with external partners, because we need the external partners with the capabilities who can move much quicker than we can, particularly those of us that are in the big pharma side of things. It is the Titanic. It takes a long time to turn the ship. It's also a lot easier in some structures to get investment to work with a partner than it is to build up a whole team and actually get headcount and everything that goes with it. So it's often that kind of ability to how can we adapt. But I like the idea of over a period of time, maybe bringing things in-house and establishing it and thinking about it at a centralized level about how we would go with it. I do think it comes back to that point as well about how we use the insight. And I think for me, there's no surprises when I look around the readiness to change and the ability to do that. It's this hesitancy to make a change, right? Do we watch and wait, like stay on target kind of approach and say it'll come, don't worry, and waiting, and then by the time we realize it's too late, it's a problem. So I think it's this real mixture of we want agile systems, but how do we translate that into business actions as well? Because we want the insights really quickly, but we're not necessarily using them very quickly. And that's one of the things we're going to have to overcome. Maybe it comes back to the point earlier on, trust in the systems, trust in the way it's been built, what can be done much quicker, the fact it took weeks down to hours. AI is becoming part of our life, but also understanding that we're going to have to put more trust into that system. And actually understanding the models that it's using and how it can help us there. So a bit of a mixture of both, right? Partnership, agility is key, but a long-term view, I'm 100% behind, because I think particularly from a global strategy point of view, you can't work on 12-month cycles. It makes it very, very difficult to have something meaningful if you're not planning to try and change standard of care or get better outcomes, etc. And you need repetition of insights often to measure if that change is coming through, because it doesn't happen normally overnight.
Do you think, Chris, and I've launched another poll just to get the audience's opinion on this implementation point that we are finishing on here, but do you think, Chris, that it's all very easy to say we can't operate on 12-month cycles and have this short-termist view and just kind of protect ourselves? The reality is that everything appears to be organized on 12-month cycles, targets, budgets, even, I would even argue, roles. People don't stay in them for very long. I don't know. I feel like that sounds, well, it's definitely easier said than done.
I think it's a good point. I agree. I think in various buckets where you sit, if you look from the coming kind of closest to the market up from the operational standpoint, you should be working in a small short term, taking action, seeing results very quickly. So maybe even less than 12 months, and seeing that things are working on a quarter by quarter basis. If you consider a lot of the traditional structure, the region is about driving performance. Now that's more of maybe a 1 to 2, 1 to 3 year range, and then global really should be much bigger picture. But I do take your point, and we do it ourselves, is we do end up taking a short-term view because the strategy is we need to make this work, which means everybody is going to focus on it. So everyone's timeframes gets crunched down. If we in global are measuring in a 12-month window, that means that everybody else is also reducing down their time frame, or we're all sitting on top of each other measuring the same thing over the same amount of time and hoping for a different piece of information meaning something different at those various levels. So I agree. I think the perfect world is longer time frames with strategic investments over multiple years. But the reality of our industry right now is a lot of short-termism to manage cash flow, budgets, and difficult situations whilst we go through the problems the industry is seeing around end of life of a lot of products and LRFPs with valleys created in them, because the long-term gain is there, but the short-term pain is something that we're all trying to manage through, and that's creating these 12-month blocks of activity, I think. So yeah, it's a good point, but we might not overcome it within the next 12 months, for example.
How ironic. Well, listen, speaking of short time frames, we've only got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to end this poll in a second, and only 40% of you have answered it, so please answer that. And we've just heard from Chris on what he thinks we can do to overcome we need more long-termism in our decision-making and more short-termism in our ability to pivot according to the data. So I want to hear from also Damien, Lance, and Liv. If you had that magic wand, and you're only getting a sentence on this each because we haven't got time, sorry. But what are you going to do to make sure we act on the data and have the long-term interests at heart when we do so? I realize, as I said, way easier said than done. Any magic wand thing that you would love to see us change in our industry, just to finish on?
I'll take a different slant on a little bit in that that humans act on the data and humans change things and humans make decision. And I think if we continue to and I think there's an entire consulting world whose job it is, right, is to try to take all of these things and create narratives and help senior level humans make these sorts of decisions. I wish we could do a better job there, either enabling that part to go faster or making that part easier. Because I agree, you can have wonderful data, but without that mechanism of being able to communicate it and convince folks to move quickly, it creates so much internal challenge and forces people kind of into that mode I think Chris was talking about, where we're just kind of stacked up against these deadlines. So I'd like to see more thought. We're certainly trying to, but more thought put into how can you get the insight to decision done differently from a communication standpoint versus let me go create a 30-page PowerPoint deck and schedule a meeting 6 weeks from now and try to convince someone to do something different.
Sure. Well, if you haven't seen the poll results, we've got a bizarrely even answer on there, but not the good answer. So we only 9% of people saying we investigate immediately, and I'll let you read the other ones because we're running out of time, and I want Damien and Liv to have that final sentence. So, guys, one sentence each.
I'll go one. Less theory, more action. That's all. We just need to stop talking about stuff and just get on with doing. And
what are you doing on this webinar? Stop
I
talking about
know.
it.
Can we stop
Doing
talking about
everyone.
it and just go and do something? Yeah. We just need to get better,
Marvelous.
faster at acting.
Marvelous, marvelous. My final little next steps poll is arriving, by the way. Damien, you got the final word.
Beyond all the great points that we just made, I would just say that we need to stop looking at things as if we don't exist in a very complicated world with people struggling with daily challenges and very insane crises going on around us. Too many of our strategies exist within a bubble of pharma, and all of these strategies are focused on what we think might happen from a world that doesn't exist anymore. We need to adjust to the world that we live in.
Well, exactly. Thank you very much, guys. So my big takeaway, I think, is that why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you employ the tools and technology to gather those insights? I realize that gathering them is only one half of the equation, acting them on is another. But it does feel to me, to draw on what Lance said earlier, if we don't know, we don't know. And I think that we are trying to operate with one arm behind our back if we continue without that ability. And as the phrase says, if you're stuck in a difficult place without a flashlight, condoms, and rolling papers, then you're going to be in a tricky situation. So, thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate your time today. You've been marvelous to share what you've shared, and I think that we've certainly learnt a lot. I want to say a special thank you to Chris because he's actually joining while he's on vacation. So. Special thanks to Chris for taking that time, and super thanks to Lance and his team who actually made today's webinar happen. Without them, this wouldn't be. So definitely worth digging into some of the stuff that they're working on if you haven't already. Also, I really enjoyed the chat. I thought we had a really nice active chat window today. Really enjoyed the conversation. I realized we couldn't get to all the questions. Some people throwing in both negative as well as positive comments that we should attempt to address. I really appreciate that. If you want to throw in any suggestions for the future, please do. But I'm aware we are already at 2 minutes past the hour. I'm going to end the webinar now and just say a massive thank you to all of you for being part of this. Please stay tuned. Make sure you do go on summer vacation if you haven't already. And otherwise, of course, it's been an absolute pleasure. We'll see you next time. Thanks a lot, everybody.